The sun was sinking low, spilling gold and crimson across the wide, empty sky. The land was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made a man's chest feel heavier than the saddle he carried. Dust clung to his boots, and every step echoed like a secret no one wanted to hear. He had lived alone on this stretch of land for years, just him, his cattle, and the endless horizon. People said the prairie could drive a man mad if he stayed too long without company. Maybe they were right. He had learned to keep his head down, to trust no one, to let the days bleed into each other without expecting change. But change has a way of finding a man, even when he doesn't ask for it. On this evening, as he walked further than usual, something strange caught his eye. At first, it looked like a broken branch swaying against the dying light. He almost ignored it. Out here, you learn quick that not everything you see is worth noticing. But then, as the wind shifted, he saw it was no branch. It was a shape, a small figure hanging in the stillness, barely moving. His chest tightened. His steps grew quicker, heavier, until there was no mistaking what it was. The closer he got, the more the details carved themselves into his mind. A girl, no older than 15, suspended from the rough bark of a tree. Her skin was dark with the hue of the Apache, her dress torn, her feet dangling inches above the ground. She was limp, her body swaying softly as the wind whispered through the leaves. And then he saw it. A piece of wood nailed above her, words carved deep and crooked. "White man don't forgive." The words struck him harder than any bullet could. His heart pounded in his chest, his mouth dry, his thoughts clouded by fear and anger. He didn't know who put her there or why they wanted him, or anyone, to see this message. But he knew it was meant to burn itself into memory. The land already carried its share of grudges, but this was different. This was personal. He froze under the tree, staring at her face. Eyes closed, lips pale. For a moment he thought he was too late. Then just barely her chest moved. A breath, weak but there. And that was when the loneliness he had carried for so long cracked wide open. Someone had left her to die, but now the choice lay in his hands. Would he turn away like the world wanted him to, or step closer into the storm? He was no stranger to silence. Out on the far edge of the frontier, silence wasn't a visitor. It was a companion that stayed whether you wanted it or not. The rancher had grown used to it, though he never truly welcomed it. Each morning began with the same sound, the creak of the wooden door, the crunch of dry soil under his boots, the groan of tired cattle waiting to be fed. Then came the stillness again, days that stretched into weeks, weeks into years, until time itself felt like a river that had stopped flowing. He had once known what it was like to have voices around him. A family, neighbors, men who rode beside him in younger years. But those faces had been claimed by the land, or by war, or by the choices men made when pride turned sharper than a knife. He had buried more than one friend in the dust. He had lost more than he dared admit. That was why he stayed out here, alone, miles from the nearest settlement. Out here, no one asked questions. Out here, no one betrayed you. His cabin was nothing more than rough pine logs stacked against the wind. The roof leaked when the rains came. The boards creaked when storms tore across the plains. And the nights were colder than a man ought to bear alone. But he bore them anyway. A rifle by the door, a lantern half filled with oil, and a Bible he hadn't opened in years were the closest things to company. It was a lonely life, but it was safe. And safety was worth more than gold to him. The land around his ranch stretched out like an ocean of dust and rock. Some days it seemed beautiful, endless skies painted with colors no man could name, stars brighter than fire when the night fell. But beauty in these parts always came with a price. Behind every ridge could be a rider waiting with a rifle. In every shadow, there could be danger. The rancher had learned to read the land like a book, spotting tracks where others saw only dirt, sensing when the wind carried more than just dust. That instinct had kept him alive. He didn't trust towns. Too many eyes watching, too many hands eager to take what wasn't theirs. He rode into town maybe once a month, just long enough to buy salt, flour, tobacco, and whatever supplies would last. He never lingered. Folks whispered when he passed, wondering why a man would choose to live alone. Some said he was running from something. Others said he carried guilt so heavy he couldn't stand to be near people. He never answered and they never pressed. Out here every man had ghosts. But ghosts didn't keep you warm at night. They didn't talk back when the walls closed in. Sometimes, when the silence grew too sharp, he found himself speaking out loud just to hear another voice, even if it was his own. He'd mutter about the weather, curse the stubborn cattle, laugh bitterly at old memories. Then he'd stop, ashamed, reminding himself that loneliness was better than betrayal, better than losing someone else, better than opening his heart only to have it torn apart again. The world beyond his ranch was changing. Settlers kept pushing further west, hungry for land, water, and gold. Railroads cut across the wilderness, bringing with them more people, more law, and more trouble. And with every push forward, the old ways were being crushed under boots and iron wheels. The Apache, the Comanche, the tribes that had walked this land long before men like him came. Every year they were pushed back, cornered, hunted. Some fought back with fire and blood. Others faded into the shadows, waiting for the day the earth would take back what was stolen. The rancher understood the anger. He had seen enough bloodshed between settlers and Apache to know that both sides carried wounds that would never heal. Some called it survival, others called it justice. He called it madness. Out here, revenge seemed to pass down through generations, like a curse whispered into children's ears before they even knew the meaning of hate. He didn't want a part in it. That's why he kept his distance. No alliances, no enemies, just the cattle, the dust, and the quiet. But even in quiet lives, the past had a way of creeping back. Sometimes it came in the form of a rider at dusk, knocking on your door with old debts to settle. Sometimes it came in the form of memories, unshakable and cruel, reminding you of choices you'd rather forget. And sometimes it came in the shape of something you never expected, something that shattered the wall you built between yourself and the world. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he saw that girl hanging from the tree, his silence would break. His safe distance would vanish. The land he thought he understood would show him a darker truth. He had always believed he could survive alone, that no one could drag him back into the storm of men's hatred. But the prairie was never a place for peace. It was a place of trials, a place that tested not only a man's strength but his soul. That evening, before the discovery, he had felt the weight of the silence heavier than usual. The air seemed restless, the wind unsettled, as if the land itself was warning him of what lay ahead. His horse snorted nervously, ears twitching at sounds too faint for human ears. He felt it too, deep in his chest, a sense that the ground was shifting beneath him, that something unseen was waiting in the shadows. He tried to shake it off, to tell himself it was nothing but nerves. But instincts rarely lied, and his instincts told him that his world was about to change. When the first glimpse of that swaying figure caught his eye, he didn't yet know what it meant. But he knew one thing with certainty. The silence he had lived with for so long was about to be broken, and nothing he did could stitch it back together again. The moment he saw her, the air seemed to vanish from his lungs. For a heartbeat, he thought he was staring at death. The figure swayed gently with the evening breeze, limp against the ropes that cut into her wrists. The tree stood like a sentinel, its twisted branches stretched across the blood-red sky, as though holding the secret of what it had been forced to bear. He froze, the world narrowing to that single sight. Every sound faded. No rustle of the grass, no cry of a bird, just the thud of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His boots moved before his mind caught up. Heavy steps crunching over dry soil, each one feeling louder than it should, as though the whole prairie could hear him coming. He wanted to look away, to pretend it was nothing more than a cruel trick of shadows. But he couldn't. The closer he came, the more details cut into him like barbed wire. The girl's hair was tangled and matted, her dress torn, her feet dangling just inches above the ground. She was small, far too small to be hanging there. She could not have seen more than 15 summers. Above her head, nailed crudely into the bark, was the sign. The words, carved deep and jagged, burned into the wood as if to make sure they'd never fade. "White man don't forgive." The letters seemed to bleed into the fading light, each one a wound on the land itself. His eyes stuck on those words. He knew anger when he saw it. He knew revenge. This wasn't a random act. This was a message, a warning. He stood still, staring at her lifeless body. His throat tightened, his hands curled into fists. He wanted to believe she was gone, that there was nothing he could do, that he could turn away and leave it behind. But then, so faint he almost missed it, her chest moved. Just a whisper of breath, fragile as morning mist. His stomach dropped. She was alive. Barely, but alive. The rancher's hand reached for the knife at his belt. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Cutting her down wasn't just an act of mercy. It was a choice that could drag him into a storm he'd spent years avoiding. If someone had left her here as a message, then saving her meant defying that message. And men who wrote warnings in blood and wood didn't take kindly to defiance. He stepped closer, the rope creaking as the girl's body shifted slightly. Her face was pale beneath the dirt, her lips cracked and dry. He could see bruises along her arms, marks that spoke of struggle. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted her dead immediately. They wanted her suffering to be seen. They wanted someone, maybe him, maybe anyone, to stumble upon her and understand that hatred still ruled these lands. He pressed the knife against the rope. The blade shook as he hesitated. His mind was a storm of voices. Leave her. Walk away. This isn't your fight. But another voice, buried deep and long forgotten, whispered louder. She's still breathing. She's still alive. The rope snapped with a sharp crack and her body slumped forward. He caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her against his chest. She was light, far too light, as if she'd been starved for weeks. Her eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment. Dark, wide, and filled with something he couldn't quite name. Fear, pain, maybe even defiance. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, only a faint rasp of air. Then her head dropped against his shoulder and she was still again. He glanced around, every nerve alive with the sense of being watched. The prairie stretched silent and empty, but that meant nothing. Out here, danger had a way of hiding in plain sight. A rifle could be aimed from a ridge. Eyes could be watching from behind the brush. He had to move. Fast. He lifted her carefully, her weight hardly more than a sack of grain. His horse stood a short distance away, ears twitching, nostrils flaring as though it too sensed the unease in the air. The rancher laid her across the saddle gently, securing her with a blanket. His own hands worked quickly, his eyes scanning the horizon again and again. Shadows lengthened across the land, stretching like dark fingers reaching toward him. As he mounted up, he couldn't shake the sign from his mind. "White man don't forgive." Those words weren't meant just for show. They carried the weight of blood. He knew enough of the old conflicts to understand this was more than a cruel act. This was a mark of vengeance, of anger carried down through generations. By cutting her down, he wasn't just saving a girl. He was stepping into a war of grudges he had spent his life avoiding. The horse shifted under him, hooves crunching the dry earth as he turned back toward his cabin. The girl lay limp against the saddle, each shallow breath a reminder of the fragile line she walked between life and death. He wanted to tell himself this was only temporary, that he'd bring her back, give her water, patch her wounds, and leave her to heal. That maybe she'd disappear as quietly as she had arrived. But deep down, he already knew better. A man could run from his past. He could hide from people. He could bury his secrets beneath years of silence. But there were some choices you couldn't run from, no matter how hard you tried. And as the last light of day sank below the horizon, the rancher understood that he had crossed a line. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew the moment he cut her down, her fight had become his. And whether he wanted it or not, the prairie would make sure he paid the price. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than it ever had before. Each hoofbeat seemed to drum against the silence, carrying the weight of a choice he could never take back. The girl lay slumped across the saddle in front of him, her breathing shallow, her body fragile as a bird's. He could feel the heat of fever rising off her skin, could hear the faint catch in her breath with every exhale. He kept one arm steady around her, holding her in place, as though letting go for even a moment might send her slipping back into the darkness she had been left to die in. When the cabin finally came into sight, it didn't look like shelter. It looked like a test. The rough logs, the sagging roof, the smoke that barely drifted from the chimney. This was a place meant for one man, not for two. And certainly not for a wounded girl carrying the weight of a message that could set fire to everything around them. But it was all he had. He dismounted quickly, lifting her from the saddle with more care than he thought he still possessed. She was light, frighteningly so, and he could feel each bone through her skin. Inside, he laid her down on his bed, the only one he owned. The room was dim, lit by the last glow of a lantern and the flicker of fire in the hearth. He fetched water from the jug, dipping a cloth to press against her forehead. The girl stirred slightly, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came, only a faint whisper that vanished before it reached him. He sat by her side, his rough hands clumsy as he cleaned the dirt from her skin, rinsed the blood from her wrists where the ropes had torn into her flesh. She flinched when the water touched her wounds, a sharp intake of breath that told him she wasn't as unconscious as she seemed. Her eyes opened for a flicker of a moment, dark eyes, sharp even in weakness. They met his, and in that instant he saw more than pain. He saw distrust, suspicion, and a deep, unyielding strength. She didn't know who he was, and she didn't trust him. Not yet. He spoke quietly, though the sound of his own voice felt strange after so many days without use. "You're safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure if the words were true. "Nobody's gonna hurt you tonight." The words fell flat, unanswered. But he kept speaking, more to fill the silence than to expect a reply. He told her she needed to drink, that she had to hold on, that he wasn't going to let her die. He didn't know if she understood, but sometimes words weren't meant for understanding. They were meant for keeping a man from drowning in his own thoughts. As he worked, questions gnawed at him. Who had done this to her? Why had they chosen that tree, that sign, those words? And why now? The wars between settlers and the Apache had quieted some in recent years, though quiet never meant peace. Tensions still ran deep, and grudges still burned hot. Was she a victim of revenge? Was she meant to be bait? Or was she carrying a story too dangerous for anyone else to hear? Her silence gave him no answers. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes staring at him with guarded eyes, sometimes lost in a fevered haze. Once in the middle of the night she whispered something in Apache, words he couldn't understand. Her voice was raw, broken, but filled with emotion. He didn't press her. He simply sat beside her, listening, as though the sound alone carried meaning. The rancher wasn't a man of medicine, but he knew enough about wounds to keep her alive. He bound her wrists with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, spooned small amounts of water between her lips, and kept the fire burning to chase the chill from her body. Every small movement of hers, a twitch of her fingers, a faint murmur, the rise and fall of her chest, became a victory in his mind. But with each victory came a shadow. The longer she stayed alive under his roof, the more dangerous his position became. Out here, secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Someone would notice. A rider passing by, a neighbor wandering too close, or a trader catching sight of her when he went for supplies. And once word spread that a white rancher was sheltering an Apache girl, one who had been left with a message carved in wood, there would be consequences. Some men would see him as a traitor. Others would see the girl as a threat. And there were those who would see both as targets. He tried to push the thought away, but it crept back again and again. He could still end this. He could leave her somewhere, close to her people if they could be found. He could wash his hands of the whole affair and return to the silence he knew. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But every time he looked at her, saw the bruises across her skin, the pain etched into her young face, he knew he couldn't do it. The choice had already been made the moment his knife cut through the rope. So he stayed awake through the night, keeping watch. Every creak of the cabin walls, every howl of the wind, every distant cry from the prairie made him grip the rifle tighter. He imagined figures moving through the dark, unseen eyes watching, waiting for him to slip. He thought about the sign nailed above that tree, the sharp strokes of each word, and the hatred that had carved them. He had brought that hatred into his home now, and he didn't know how long he could keep it from burning everything down. The girl stirred again near dawn. Her eyes opened wider this time, focusing on him with a sharpness that cut through the haze. For the first time she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, the words fragile but clear enough to understand. One word, spoken slowly, as though testing whether he could be trusted. He leaned closer, listening with all the weight of a man whose life had just been tied to a stranger's. The girl's first word lingered in the air long after her lips closed. It was short, spoken with the weight of someone who wasn't sure if she was safe yet, but who no longer had the strength to keep silent. He didn't understand its meaning, not in the way she intended, but he knew it mattered. It was trust, or maybe only a test of trust. Either way, it bound him closer to her than he wanted to admit. He gave her water again, slow and careful, watching as her throat moved with each swallow. She looked at him differently this time, her gaze steady, sharp, as though she was measuring the truth of his presence. For the next days, the cabin became something it had never been before. Not just a shelter, but a battleground of silence, suspicion, and fragile understanding. She didn't speak much, only a few broken words in her tongue, but her eyes told stories he couldn't ignore. They told him of pain, they told him of fear, and they told him of a will to live that was stronger than any rope meant to end her life. He tended to her wounds each morning, changing the cloth, giving her broth he boiled from scraps. She ate little, drank little, but every day her strength returned in small pieces. Yet the rancher knew strength wasn't just measured in breath or movement. Strength also meant danger. If she lived, she carried secrets. If she spoke, she carried truths. And men out there, men who had carved those words into wood and left her hanging, want those truths alive. He told himself that no one would know she was here, that the prairie was wide and his cabin was hidden enough. But the land had ears, and whispers traveled faster than hoofbeats. On the third evening, as he chopped wood behind the cabin, he noticed a rider on the horizon. Just a speck at first, then a figure, moving slow but steady across the plain. The rancher's hands tightened around the axe. His instincts told him the rider wasn't a friend. He finished the work, stacked the logs, and waited. By nightfall, the figure was gone, swallowed by the dusk. But the feeling stayed. He was being watched. The next day, he rode into town for supplies, leaving her hidden inside. The town was small. One dusty street lined with a saloon, a store, a blacksmith, and a few houses scattered like lost dice. He went about his business quickly, as always, but something felt different this time. Conversations hushed when he walked past. Eyes followed him longer than usual. At the store, the owner leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Hear there's trouble out your way," the man muttered. "Word is the Apache been stirring again. Folks say they found signs on trees, warnings." The rancher kept his face still, his voice flat. "Signs?" The storekeeper nodded, his eyes darting to the window as though someone might be listening. "Said one had words carved into it. Words meant to scare off white men. And if that's true, trouble's coming. You be careful out there." He paid for his supplies and left without another word, but the knot in his chest grew tighter. Someone knew about the sign. And if someone knew about the sign, how long before they knew about the girl? Back at the cabin, she was awake when he returned. Sitting upright, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the door as if she expected him not to return at all. When he set the supplies down, she didn't speak. She only watched. He wanted to tell her everything he'd heard, to ask if she knew who had put her there, why the words had been carved above her head. But he held his tongue. He knew trust couldn't be forced. That night, as the fire burned low, she finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, raw from disuse, but the words came clear enough in broken English. "They wanted me dead." He froze, every muscle in his body stiffening. Her eyes held his, dark and steady, and he could see the truth in them. He wanted to ask who they were, but she wasn't ready to say more. She closed her eyes, turning her face away, shutting herself back into the silence. The rancher sat in his chair long after she drifted to sleep. The words echoed in his mind. They wanted me dead. He didn't need the details to know what that meant. It meant someone out there had marked her, hunted her, and left her as a warning. And warnings never came alone. 2 nights later, the danger arrived at his door. A knock, heavy and sharp, just as the moon climbed high. The girl startled awake, eyes wide with fear. The rancher motioned for her to stay quiet, grabbed his rifle, and moved to the door. When he opened it, 2 men stood outside, dust covering their coats, hats low over their eyes. "Evenin'," one of them said, his tone too smooth, too polite to be honest. "We're looking for someone, thought maybe you'd seen her, Apache girl, young, small." His eyes narrowed as he studied the rancher's face. "Word is she didn't make it too far." The rancher kept his voice calm. "Ain't seen no one." The second man stepped forward, glancing past the doorframe, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Strange. Folks say she was near these parts, say there was a sign." He let the words hang, heavy with meaning. The rancher didn't move. He stood in the doorway, blocking their view, his rifle low but ready. Silence stretched between them like a drawn rope, tight and ready to snap. Finally, the first man tipped his hat, his smile cold. "Well, if you do see her, best let us know. Wouldn't want trouble finding its way here." They left, their horses kicking up dust as they rode into the night. The rancher shut the door, locking it, his jaw clenched. Behind him, the girl sat on the bed, her eyes wide, her body trembling. She didn't have to speak for him to understand. The men weren't strangers to her. She knew exactly who they were, and they weren't going to stop. The silence inside the cabin after the men rode away was heavier than the sound of their boots on the porch. The girl sat frozen, her blanket clutched tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the door as though she expected it to break open at any moment. The rancher stood there a while longer, rifle still in his hand, listening to the night, his ears strained for hoofbeats, for whispers carried by the wind, for anything that might tell him the danger had passed. But the prairie outside had gone quiet again, too quiet, and he knew well enough that quiet didn't mean safety. He lowered the rifle slowly and turned to face her. Her breathing was fast, shallow, and though she tried to keep her face calm, he could see the fear trembling in her fingers as they clutched the blanket tighter. He wanted to tell her she was safe, that the men wouldn't be back, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. He had looked into the eyes of men like that before, and he knew what they carried inside them. Hatred didn't knock once and ride away. It circled, it waited, it came back. Through the long hours of that night, he sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees. Sleep never came. Every creak of the timbers, every gust of wind against the shutters felt like a warning. The girl drifted in and out, her eyes opening every time the flames popped, her body jerking as though she expected the men to walk through the walls. Sometimes she whispered in Apache, words he didn't understand, but the tone of them was enough, prayers or curses, he couldn't tell which. By dawn, the rancher knew one thing for certain. Keeping her here meant he was no longer alone in his fight. Whatever storm she carried with her had now taken root inside his cabin, and the men who had come knocking weren't going to let it go. He tried to push away the thought of what they might do if they returned with more riders, but the thought lingered all the same. He had been a man who lived apart from the world, who avoided sides, who sought peace in isolation. But peace had ended the moment he cut her down. Later that day, she surprised him. She stood on her own for the first time since he had brought her back. Her steps were shaky, her body still weak, but there was fire in her eyes. She looked at him, then at the rifle leaning by the hearth, and for a moment he saw not a girl but someone forged by hardship, someone who had endured far more than her years should have allowed. She spoke slowly, her English broken but her meaning clear enough. "They come back. They kill you, kill me." He met her gaze and didn't deny it. There was no sense in pretending otherwise. But what caught him off guard was the steel in her voice. She wasn't just afraid, she was ready. Ready to fight, ready to resist, ready to take her place against the ones who had tried to erase her. The rancher began to prepare in silence. He fixed the loose boards on the windows, checked the lantern oil, sharpened the knife he carried at his belt. The girl watched him, her expression unreadable, until finally she moved closer and touched the rifle. She didn't ask for it, but her hand rested on the wood as if to say she was no stranger to its weight. He realized then that she wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor, carrying scars that spoke of battles fought long before he found her on that tree. As evening fell, the prairie stretched out in a wash of fading light, and with it came the sense of something inevitable drawing near. The rancher and the girl shared a meal in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. When darkness settled fully, they both sat awake, listening. The hoofbeats came before midnight, faint at first, then clearer, like drums rolling across the earth. The girl's hand gripped the edge of the bed, her knuckles white. The rancher rose, rifle in hand, and moved to the door. Outside, shadows gathered, 3 riders this time, maybe 4, their shapes just visible against the starlight. They didn't call out, didn't knock. They circled slow, like wolves testing their prey. The rancher felt his chest tighten. This was the moment the prairie had been leading him toward. All the years of silence, of hiding from the world, of convincing himself he could live untouched, it all ended here, with a girl who should have been dead and a sign that warned of unforgiveness. He glanced back at her once, saw her eyes fixed on him, and in that look was something unspoken. Not a plea, not a command, but a recognition. They were bound together now. The men outside shifted, the sound of leather and iron drifting through the night. One of them called out, his voice sharp and mocking, "We know she's in there. Hand her over and maybe we'll let you live." The rancher didn't answer. His finger rested steady on the trigger. The girl rose slowly to her feet, standing behind him, her body still weak but her eyes fierce. She whispered something in her own tongue, words meant for her people, words meant for herself. And though he didn't understand them, the rancher felt their strength settle into the room like another presence. The riders waited. The cabin walls seemed to close in, the firelight flickering shadows across their faces. The rancher knew the choice was no longer his alone. It was theirs together. And as the tension stretched thin as the rope that had once held her, he realized the prairie had finally forced his hand. There was no more silence to hide behind. The storm had come to his door, and he was standing in its center.